When we look at Japan in the modern day, we see a booming 22nd century metropolis of skyscrapers, lights, and technology with a great economy and income. In fact, their income is so good that they're currently suffering the effects of an aging population. Like most other technologically advanced nations in the world, Japan wasn't always like this. In fact, less than a century ago, Japan was a rather poor militaristic East Asian empire, with its leadership so adamant on never surrendering until they took over all of the Pacific. The Japanese Imperial Army was so stubborn that it took not one, but two nuclear bombs from the United States for them to actually finally admit defeat. But in this video, I'll be looking into an alternate timeline where instead of nuking Japan, the US simply decided to take the long way round and invade the mainland in order to bring them to their knees. But like always, before we discuss fake history, we need to understand real history. At the dawn of the 20th century, Japan, who just half a century prior was an isolated island nation, was beginning to gain nationalistic and expansionistic desires. By 1910, the Korean peninsula was completely subdued by the Japanese, and World War I gave Japan the opportunity to invade German holdings in the Pacific and China. In 1931, Japan took a massive slice out of northern China, turning it into a puppet state called Manchuria. Before this, Japan had already been chipping away at parts of China, but now they were showing ambitions of completely taking over the entire nation. In 1937, the Second Sino-Japanese War began and lasted until 1945. During the war, the Japanese Imperial Army pushed south into China, founding new puppet states and committing some of the worst atrocities known to man. The war soon became just an extension of the larger World War II, where Japan joined the Axis powers and took French Indochina, Siam, Burma, Malay, Singapore, and was beginning to voice its interest in invading India, the Soviet Union, and the Philippines. There was one country, however, that could have potentially served as a thorn in Japan's side and needed to be dealt with: the United States. In order to make sure their expansion in East Asia wouldn't be contested, Japan wanted to make sure that the US naval fleet was completely crippled. So on December 7, 1941, the US port in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, was attacked. However, instead of crippling the US, Japan simply aggravated them, and FDR soon declared war on the empire. The US began an island-hopping campaign, slowly pushing the Japanese out of the Pacific and East Asia over the span of 4 years. But while they were doing that, American scientists began working on the Manhattan Project, a plan to build the most powerful weapon in the world by splitting uranium atoms. In August of 1945, the US dropped one of these atom bombs on the Japanese city of Hiroshima, and a couple days later, since Japan still wasn't surrendering, they dropped a second one on Nagasaki. These two bombs crippled the two cities, and the Japanese Emperor Hirohito, out of fear that a bomb could be dropped on Tokyo, finally surrendered to the US. The US military occupied Japan in the years following the war until 1952. Towards the late 20th century, Japan saw a period of growth and stability, later building it into the modern high-income country that it is today. But what if that was different? What if in an alternate universe, instead of the US simply nuking Japan, the Allied powers launched a full-on invasion of the mainland, bringing the country to its knees and taking over the island by force? What if Japan was invaded in World War II? The point of divergence is actually simpler than you may think. In the 4 years between 1941 and 1945, the Manhattan Project becomes severely delayed. By 1945, President Truman begins to grow increasingly impatient, and with Japan almost completely surrounded by the US Navy, he orders an invasion of the Japanese mainland. Easy. Now for the timeline. In 1941, the Japanese Air Force attacked Pearl Harbor, bringing the United States into the Second World War. The US government was outraged by this attack and wanted justice, so they secretly began development of the Manhattan Project. By 1945, the Axis powers were on the defensive side of the war. In May, the Third Reich had fallen at the hands of the Allies, while in the Pacific, what was left of the Japanese Navy was on the run as the US military seized island after island of Japanese Pacific territory. The Japanese government was getting desperate, and soon began recruiting young men to carry out suicide kamikaze attacks on American ships. While on certain islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the Japanese fought ferociously against the invading Americans, inflicting many casualties. One thing to note about the Japanese is that they believed the worst thing a man could do was surrender on the battlefield. By the summer, the US was on its way to defeating Japan. There was just one problem, though. The Manhattan Project was suffering major setbacks, and US President Truman was beginning to consider invading the mainland of Japan rather than wait for the project to be finished. By early August, it seems as though an invasion would be the only option for the US, and so plans are made to launch Operation Downfall on the Japanese. Also, in August of 1945, the Soviets declare war on the Japanese and invade Manchuria. On the misty morning of November 1st, 1945, after months of blockades around the Japanese mainland, American forces make several landings on the island of Kyushu, using Okinawa as a base. Long story short, the landings don't go so well. In fact, they go horribly for both sides. The Kyushu beaches turn into a bloodbath, killing more soldiers than D-Day, with the Japanese attempting to defend the island with all their force. As the Americans advanced through the island, the Japanese would burn down every city and village they approach, at an enormous cost of innocent Japanese lives. The Battle of Nagasaki in December of 1945 would have been nicknamed America's Stalingrad, with the city being reduced to a pile of rubble. While America struggles in Japan, the Soviets would have swiftly taken all of Manchuria and would have begun to push into Korea. In March of 1946, the US would begin the second phase of their invasion and, with the help of the British Royal Navy, make landings on the Japanese main island of Honshu, while the Soviets would begin to invade the northern island of Hokkaido and eventually the northern mainland, meeting the same amount of ferocious Japanese resistance as the Americans. The US would carry out bombing campaigns over Japanese villages and cities as they pushed towards Tokyo. The Allies would finally reach the outskirts of Tokyo by around November of 1946. The resulting Battle of Tokyo would have been an absolute bloodbath. In fact, to call it a bloodbath would be an understatement. It would be only at this point that the Japanese Emperor would surrender to the Allied powers and the Japanese Empire would have finally fallen, ending World War II in 1947. Following the war, Japan would have been divided between the Allies. The Soviets would have occupied the north, while the US, the UK, and the Republic of China would have occupied the south. Korea would have been completely occupied by the Soviets and would have been given independence by 1950 as the DPRK. This means that the Korean War would simply not happen. As for the Chinese Civil War, with the Americans having less influence over East Asia already in the beginning of the Cold War, they would have made more of an effort to send aid to the nationalists. I doubt this would have led to an alternate nationalist victory. Whether the CCP would have still completely won or whether mainland China would have been divided into two is debatable. For the sake of keeping things simple, let's just assume that the Chinese Communist Party under Mao would have still won the Chinese Civil War, and the KMT would have still been exiled to Taiwan. As for Japan, they would remain under joint Allied occupation until 1954, when the Soviets would establish a communist puppet government in the north, known as the People's Republic of Japan, with its capital in Sapporo, and due to the Red Scare, the US would give the South independence as an American-aligned nation called the Republic of Japan, with its capital in Kyoto and the emperor as a puppet constitutional monarch. Tokyo would have been divided between these two countries. Throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, both countries would experience poverty, post-war trauma, and social unrest. North Japan would turn into an extreme Stalinist totalitarian dictatorship. Especially in the South, there would still be an imperialist anti-American resistance movement, occasionally carrying out terrorist attacks on several US and Soviet bases. This would be a very big issue in the decades after the war. It's unclear whether or not the post-war trauma would have led to a Japanese mainland proxy war between these two nations or not, just like the Korean War. Most of the Cold War would still go in a similar way. The Vietnam War, the moon landing, the arms race, etc. The US, however, as stated before, would have less influence over East Asia and would invest more effort into proxy wars like Vietnam, possibly leading to an alternate Southern victory. The Berlin Wall would still fall, and the US would still win the Cold War. With the fall of the Soviet Union, Japan would reunify under the Southern government in 1994. Japan, however, would be almost unrecognizable. Dealing with the struggles of reunification alone would be enough to cripple the Japanese economy, and, with most of the Japanese cities not being fully rebuilt since the war, Japan would almost be a third world country in some places. Aging population would not be an issue. In fact, there's a chance Japan would currently be suffering the effects of a youthful population. Japan would not be the world economic player it is today, and many different companies and brands we know and love in our timeline would most likely not exist. The biggest change in the alternate timeline, however, would be this. See, the reason why modern Japanese anime exists is due to American soldiers coming into contact with various North Japanese artists, who used new skills to eventually develop the new animation industry. However, without American soldiers being present in the North in this alternate timeline, this means that it would simply never have existed. There is a chance that anime would simply take the form of Japanese communist propaganda in this timeline, but it's unlikely. So, essentially, weebs don't exist in this universe. Honestly, make your own assumptions as to whether or not that's actually a bad thing. When looking at the timeline, we can see that an invasion of Japan was pretty much a last resort for the Allies. If they had invaded, the casualties would have been devastating, and the post-war effects of the invasion would have had lasting implications on the country. So with that in mind, should the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki be considered a necessary act that was done to end the war swiftly? I'll leave that judgment up to you. Thank you all for watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and be sure to tell me in the comments what you think the next alternate history scenario should be. See ya!